So this lecture is about the presidency of John Adams, and as always, I want you to take a look at your objective. This is what the district has identified for you, what they want you to understand about John Adams's presidency. They want you to be able to explain, think short essay question, the major domestic and international economic, military, political, and socio-cultural events of John Adams's presidency. So look at the words I bolded there. You remember domestic, I would hope, from 7th grade, a vocabulary word meaning at home, which is not too hard to remember considering we've got it paired here with international. So domestic being in our home country. Pay attention to political, of course, dealing with government and dealing with the interaction of political aims. And then I want you to look at socio-cultural, because this is a word you'll start to encounter more and more in the future. But think, for the purposes of categorizing, because I'm going to ask you to categorize, think of socio-cultural as things that deal with society, the ways that people interact outside of government. Think of that as the way that people interact, and culture being things people value. So when you're looking for the socio-cultural events in here, think of those as people's interactions and the beliefs of a culture. So I want you to list these. You might want to leave a line after each of them, but I do want you to, because these are going to be the 6 most important things that you'll need to know about John Adams's presidency. Go ahead and pause it and do that. And you're going to return to this at the end. And then naturally, when I see you in class, I'm going to ask you to reproduce this in a classroom question. So go ahead and do that. I'm going to move on. This is a brief review from the previous section. It's super important to me that you know what impressment is. And here's an image that gives you some idea, maybe some reminder of what it is. Remember from the last section that impressment was this practice of kidnapping American soldiers and then forcing them to join the British Navy. You see him sort of being hogtied here and carried off to join the British Navy. This was an especially egregious offense that the British were doing. You should also, of course, remember that the British were in the Northwest Territory when they weren't supposed to be, and arming Native Americans against the Americans who were attempting to move into that Ohio River Valley until, of course, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So picture this when you picture impressment. Now, this is going to continue to be a problem and eventually going to lead to our next big war. The Federalists, notwithstanding all of these events with the British, are still trying to maintain these friendly relations with Great Britain. And the main reason for this is trade. The statistics that will make you understand that is that 75% of the things that Americans exported and sold, they sold to Great Britain, and 90% of the goods that they imported came from Great Britain. So this is a really practical need to maintain these relations with Great Britain, especially if you are a merchant or someone who makes their living by trade, which, as you know, was the source of the Federalists, the greatest number of members of the Federalists. Think about the Southerners, on the other hand, who were more farmers. So as part of the Jay Treaty, take a look at the things that were agreed upon. Under the Jay Treaty, the U.S. agreed to pay some of the debts that it still owed to merchants. And Great Britain did make several agreements. They said that they would pay for some of the ships that they had seized, because not only are they seizing American sailors, but they're seizing American ships. And they would withdraw finally from the Northwest Territory, and they would stop aiding those Native Americans. What they refused to do as part of the Jay Treaty was to recognize that the U.S. had every right to trade with France as an independent country, and they also refused to stop impressment. So you can see how people would have been frustrated with Jay's Treaty, because that was the point of it going into those negotiations, was that it was going to stop this practice of impressment right here, and it didn't do that. Now, Federalists, as you can imagine, supported the Jay Treaty. It passed very narrowly, and there was a lot of disapproval by the Republicans, because remember that the Federalists were pro-British and the Republicans were supporting France at that time. Now, the French were already angry at us because we were maintaining neutrality. Remember that Great Britain and France are at war for huge periods of this time. The French, I guess, kind of reasonably expected that we would get in on their side because, as you know from the American Revolution, they were so crucial to our success. And first, they're upset about our neutrality, which you should expect from considering Washington's farewell address, how he urged neutrality and urged avoiding permanent alliances like the one that it looked like we were forming with Great Britain. And now that when the Jay Treaty was passed, that really looks like we're just straight up siding with Great Britain. In response to that, the Americans attempted to send over a new diplomat. The French refused to accept this diplomat. They continue attacking American merchant ships. And really, this is a bad position to be in because now Americans are not only being impressed or kidnapped and forced into servitude by British, they're also being attacked by the French. So this is not a tenable situation. And what comes out of it is something that's called the XYZ affair. So Adams, as president, sensing that they needed a solution to this problem, sent a new 3-person commission to France, and they were going to negotiate an end to the hostilities. They wanted a treaty, something like the Jay Treaty with Great Britain that they could have with France, because in an ideal world, even if you're a merchant who supports Great Britain, trading with as many people as possible is best. So the official French minister, a man named Talleyrand, and that's him right there, he refused to meet even with the Americans. He instead sent 3 agents below him, people who came to be called X, Y, and Z because their names were kept secret. He sent them in his place. These agents demanded a $250,000 bribe just to speak with the foreign minister, Talleyrand, and they also demanded a multi-million-dollar loan for France to help them fight their war with Great Britain. The Americans naturally were offended because we are quick to be offended, and they refused to pay this bribe. They expected that they would be treated like diplomats and that they would get to speak to the official French minister. Now, it's worth noting that giving bribes to talk to a minister, even especially him, Talleyrand, was common practice in Europe at the time. It really wasn't so unreasonable for him to expect them to do this because among European powers, this was quite common, but Americans certainly were offended, and the big slogan here became millions for defense and not a sixpence for tribute. So I want you to think about that for a second, because you're going to see that in response, President Adams is going to build up the American Navy, is going to build up the American forces, but they're going to refuse to pay even a cent. And if you remember from world history, you learned tribute when you were learning about civilizations that conquered others. Tributes were payments you made to avoid to be able to maintain your homeland. You paid these forced tribute, these payments to a greater power. So they were more than happy to spend millions on building up their army in response to this, but they swore they would never pay what they saw as a tribute to France. So this leads to what they call, there's 2 names for it. I want you to know, I've always known it as a quasi-war. Quasi is a prefix you can see there, and it means partial or something that seems like it's happening but isn't happening. The version you want here is partial. It'll also be called, in your book, the undeclared war. So while Congress never declared officially, because it's one of congressional powers, declared war with France, there was this undeclared war that raged for those 3 years. But the French demands and their perceived disrespect led to what your book calls war fever, especially among those Federalists who, as you know, were anti-France to begin with. John Adams, like I said, convinces Congress to increase the size of the army, to rebuild the American Navy, which had kind of foundered after the American Revolution and even then wasn't particularly powerful. And for this 2 to 3 year span, we fought this undeclared almost war with the French, especially in the waters. So ultimately, John Adams avoids all-out war. He doesn't want to see us go to war, and a lot of his supporters, other Federalists, felt the same way. He manages this. He sends another mission to France, and the hostilities, they managed to negotiate an end to the hostilities. France has a new emperor, which if you did the French Revolution video, you know Napoleon Bonaparte. He's got other concerns like conquering all of Europe. So this is kind of a back burner thing for him. So this quasi-war is brought to an end. The 2 most important acts or laws that were passed under John Adams, which caused a whole lot of strife in society, were the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. And both were passed in 1798 by a largely Federalist-controlled Congress. The Alien Act deals with aliens, deals with people who were not citizens, people who were pursuing citizenship, anyone from another country. The Federalists especially were fearing the ideas of these revolutionary French immigrants. As you remember, the French Revolution largely, it became quite violent, and there was some of that mob rule that we saw in Boston gets really out of control. You should remember like 15,000 people are beheaded. So Federalists were really afraid of these revolutionary ideas that were coming with these French immigrants. So their plan was to pass this law, and what it did was increase the waiting period for citizenship, which even today you have to live in the country for 5 years in order to apply for citizenship. They increased it from 5 to 14. So the likelihood that these these immigrants that they feared would then become citizens and begin voting in ways that the Federalists didn't like was decreased because it would happen they would have to wait 14 years to do that. Another thing it did was give the president power to deport, so send back to the country or imprison any alien he viewed as dangerous. That was the Alien Act. Now, ultimately, the provisions of the Alien Act are going to expire, so it'll go back down to 5 years, and the president will lose his power to deport them. But it was really troubling, of course, to Republicans at the time. But even more troubling to Republicans was the Sedition Act. Sedition is a definition you absolutely have to know. Sedition means any activity designed to overthrow a government. So the Federalists sensed the growth of the Republican Party, and they wanted to limit that. So what the Sedition Act did was to make writing or speaking anything insulting about the government, whether it was the president, the Congress, or any other part of the government, it made that a crime. And over the 2 years that it was in power, 10 people were convicted. Most of them were Republican editors or newspapermen. So when you think about the Sedition Act, I want you to think about this image. This is obviously a later image, but we're going to look at a couple of other political cartoons from that time. But the idea, of course, is that you've lost your freedom of speech, that insulting or criticizing the government is made illegal, which you should know from civics violates the Bill of Rights. The last thing we're going to talk about are the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Obviously, the Republicans are going to oppose both the Alien Act, which is going to limit French immigration in a way they see as unfair, and the Sedition Act because it's largely, they know it's targeted at them. So Thomas Jefferson, who you'll see there in Kentucky, and James Madison in Virginia write resolutions. And you need to remember what a resolution is. It's a statement of opinion passed by a body. They're going to pass these in the state legislatures, and they're going to say that the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional because they violate the Bill of Rights guarantee of freedom of speech. Now, because no one else joins in with Kentucky and Virginia, this doesn't really have much power. They managed to pass this and say that's how they feel, but it doesn't have a big effect. But it does set an important precedent. And think back to a precedent, not a rule, but when someone does something, it makes it easier for people to later do things. So the states are going to come to claim that they have the right to nullify or refuse to enforce laws that they don't agree with, like Kentucky and Virginia wanted to do with the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is going to lead to a bigger concept called states' rights, which essentially argues that because the United States is just a collection of states, the states have the right to overrule federal law if they don't agree with it. And you should be able to reason by you should be able to conclude from that if the states don't approve of a law and the federal government doesn't listen to them, they might choose to say secede. So you're going to see this idea and this cry of nullification of laws they don't agree with and states' rights to nullify federal laws is going to come up again, especially dealing with slavery. So I want you to go back to the list that you made in the beginning, and I want you to characterize, just right off to the side next to it, I want you to categorize or characterize each of these as either domestic or international. And then I want you to characterize them as military, political, or sociocultural. And these may be interchangeable and you can put more than one, but I want you to go through and for each one, label it domestic or international and military, political, or sociocultural. So that is John Adams' presidency. And in the future, we're going to move into our next president, Thomas Jefferson. I'll see you in class.